Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Skift Travel Podcast. It's me again, Rafat Ali, CEO and founder of Skift. I know some of you are wondering, is this my new permanent position, which is becoming the podcast host at Skift, which it's not. It's just that the people that I'm talking to are people that I've known and topics that are really interesting. And so I did one recently from Southeast Asia, and we're again focused on Southeast Asia for this week. This is impact of the Trump tariffs on ASEAN. ASEAN is Southeast Asia region, and APAC, and what has been happening since the start of April. Really started last month in March, or maybe even earlier than that, but it really took care at the start of April when the Liberation Day came, or so-called Liberation Day came. And then this podcast will post. You all will listen to it on around May 1st. So, and we're recording it mid of April. So there's a good chance that everything, the whole world would have changed. And so keep that in mind. But that said, I have two great experts, both of whom happen to live in Kuala Lumpur, one of my favorite cities in the planet. Gary Bowerman, who's the co-founder of High Yields Tourism. He's the author of this book that have liked a lot on the Chinese travelers. One of the first books on the phenomena of Chinese travelers going outbound and changing the world of travel. And then Hannah Pearson, who's the director of Pierre Anderson. This is her own consultancy firm that she's built over the years. And I've been a reader and subscriber to her newsletter on Southeast Asia for, at this point, I don't know how long it's been around, Hannah, but years now.
5 years, yeah.
5 years, wow, congratulations. And Gary has spoken to us previously on a few podcasts and also has spoken, I think, at our conferences as well. So welcome back, Gary.
Hey, Rafat, good to be with you.
So let's get into it. It's mid-April 2025. The expectations on Southeast Asia tourism was really good going into the year. Is it full recovery, Gary, technically for the region post-COVID at this point?
Not quite. It was up in the sort of 90% towards the end of last year. Good first quarter. The first quarter was really strong across the region, looking as though we're moving into a very, very strong second half of the year. And then, as you said, we're in the middle of April, and there's been just a complete upturning of the commercial sentiment in the region. But travel is still going on as normal. Airports are still full. We haven't really seen that travel time lag take effect yet. So at the moment, there is huge consternation amongst governments and businesses, but travel at the moment is still business as normal.
So sentiment versus actual numbers, there's still a gap there. Like sentiment, for instance, in the US, it's both sentiment as well as actual numbers have fallen quite a bit from various parts of the world into US. But in Southeast Asia, what's the number in terms of intra-Southeast Asia travel versus international travel? My guess is intra-Southeast Asia is a lot more. Do you know offhand?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but yeah, I mean, intra-ASEAN travel really accounts for the bulk of all ASEAN travel, just all that cross-border travel, or failing that, maybe to
Business
East Asia.
travel, family travel, etc.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually remind us what ASEAN is again.
Sure. So ASEAN is, if you think a bit like the EU, but less powerful and less coherent, but an EU, Southeast Asian version of EU. So we've got 10 countries. Yeah.
Okay. And then wasn't India at some point part of it, or no? Or they were like an observer, if I remember when I was growing up in India. That's what I remember. Okay. So back to the tariff. Is it more the tariff, or is it more China, Gary, since you're the China expert, has anything changed in terms of Chinese inbound travel into Southeast Asia? Because that's the biggest international country traveling into Southeast Asia, correct?
Yeah, so nothing's happened yet. We've had, again, pretty strong first quarter. We had Chinese New Year, which was pretty strong into most countries. But still, Rafa, we're nowhere near back to the levels that we were in 2019. So there is still gradualized recovery. Remember, China didn't reopen until 2023. So that's only the third year that it's been reopened. It has been gradual, has been slow. But the impact in terms of the tariffs, yeah, we're still waiting to see what that will be. As you said, there is a trade-off between sentiment and actual behavior. But certainly the Chinese economy is being squeezed the hardest of any economy in the world by these tariffs. So we would expect that there will be some downturn into the region for sure.
And is there a directive from the Chinese government in terms of where Chinese outbound travelers can or cannot travel?
At the moment, no. There was an advisory issued last week wasn't against travel to the United States, but it did reference that there was trade tensions between the two countries, and it referred to the domestic security situation in the US. So basically saying, unless you really have to travel to the US, don't. But at the moment, travel into Southeast Asia and into the rest of Asia Pacific, there's no restrictions at the moment.
There's no restrictions there, yeah. And in general, unlike US, where most of the travel advisories are ignored, or at least ignored by general public, they may be taken more seriously by, say, travel agents and etc., because they have liability issues there. In China, if there's a gentle advisory, typically the public really, I guess, pays attention to it. I don't know how it's publicized technically, but I don't know if you have that knowledge offhand, Gary.
Well, Hannah made this good point on the podcast last week, is that there is a divergence between the travel agency market, where there tends to be a much stronger adherence to travel warnings, as opposed to the independent market, where people make their own choice. Independent travelers from China decide when and where they're going to go. And the outbound market from China to the US is quite diversified. A lot of it is VFR, a lot of it is business, a lot of it is leisure, some of it is group, some of it is FIT. So it's a very diversified market. This isn't really particularly a strong period of time for travel to the US, but it's coming up to the summer school holiday season, which is a very, very, strong booking time.
Okay, that's true. In terms of prices, have we seen any changes in terms of airline or hotel prices? I mean, they were at all-time high. This is true across the world over the last couple of years. Has there been any pressures downwards on pricing there? There is some downward pressure here in US, domestically as well as outbound from US, inbound into US. I'm not fully sure.
Yeah. So again, I think there's a divergence. So in Asia Pacific, mostly last year, you did start to see a bit of downward pressure simply because demand had dropped a little bit compared to where it was, that immediate resurgence after the pandemic. You start to see that the demand drivers were just down a little bit. So supply was quite high, and generally prices are a bit down. In China, it's a country of deflation. There's a price war on absolutely everything, from flight tickets and hotel rooms to cups of coffee and electronic vehicles. It's a very deflationary environment in China, and that really contrasts with the rest of the world after COVID.
In terms of what regions are doing well in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, I know Thailand had really good year last year, but this year early on has been not doing so well. We did a story recently. Peyton, who's our Asia editor, I think both of you have talked to, did that story on Thailand inbound. But still, it's doing quite well. Hannah, from your perspective, what are the countries or regions that are doing well within Southeast Asia, and the ones that are not doing well?
Yeah, I mean, Vietnam. I mean, so like you say, Thailand, yes, in terms of absolute numbers, it's miles ahead of everybody else. Q1 had about 9.5 million travelers. I'd say Vietnam is the kind of runaway success for Q1, though. They are miles above where they were even in 2019. In terms of Chinese visitors, they actually had more Chinese visitors in Q1 than Thailand, which is probably a first, and really, I think, speaks to how well Vietnam is doing. In terms of struggling, what accounts? I think it's a lot down to the Chinese market coming in. I think it's just this whole shifting around. At the beginning of the year, we had this big issue with scam centers in Myanmar and a very public kidnapping of a Chinese actor in northern Thailand. And that just compounded with a lot of other things for Thailand, has just meant that it is not that country of choice for Chinese travelers in Q1, and they're looking for other countries. I mean, it's the same. You asked me who's doing badly. Philippines is doing really badly out of all the Southeast Asian countries. And again, it's China. It's China dropping, and that is down to a lot of geopolitical tensions that are going on too. So China is kind of the kingmaker in the region, as Gary said many times, they're the important source market. So if they're coming, you're going to do well, and if they're not, then you're going to struggle.
In terms of are any other substitute markets doing well? Like, for instance, India. I mean, typically, for instance, here a lot of the destinations are looking to India. Again, long haul, same as China. Will not be as many volume wise, but still pretty good. I mean, India is now one of the top source markets, overseas source markets for US outside of Canada and Mexico. Is that and I know Indians are traveling in droves to Thailand, that much I know, but I wonder if they're traveling to other parts of Southeast Asia as well. Gary, I don't know if you have some sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Thailand, I think, was the third largest market last year. So there's definitely a surge. I think what we'll see from India over the next 5 years, definitely, and probably over the next 10 years, it will be the fastest growing outbound market in the region. So in terms of where it's come from, it's coming off a much lower base than China. But if you look at the actual annualized figures, they will be much higher. They will just grow faster. The airlines are really gearing up. The tourism boards here in Southeast Asia, as you said, are really putting out all the stops, not just to attract Indian travelers from the metro cities, but from the secondary and third tier cities as well. That's really the goal going forward. And that's what happened in China maybe 10, 15 years ago. So India is definitely going to play some degree of catch up, but it's still a long way behind China at the moment. And the Middle East, I think the Middle East, there's two-way traffic with the Middle East. It's inbound and outbound. And that's why you're seeing much, much more airline traffic, airline routes, airline services, because there is passengers going both ways, which sometimes you don't get with the China and Indian markets. It tends to be one way, and then the flights going back are a little bit empty. But with the Middle East, it's two ways. Flights are always busy. Definitely one to watch. All the countries, but particularly UAE, Dubai, Saudi, Qatar, Oman, all of those.
Is most of it leisure?
A lot of it is, but some of it's business. I mean, there's a lot of investment, particularly from UAE into countries like Indonesia. So there's a lot of business going in there. There's a lot of infrastructure and tourism resort development coming from the UAE and Qatar.
And then I just add that in terms of outbound from Southeast Asia, it's a lot led with Umrah, right? So a lot of Southeast Asian countries are traveling.
That's true. I've seen so many groups that when you go to Hajj or Umrah, certainly Umrah, just a lot of groups from Malaysia, even from Thailand, obviously Indonesia, tons of them that you see as well. Yeah, 100%. In terms of you, Gary, you mentioned second tier cities from, for instance, India or even China. Are there, in terms of air route development, is there better lift into second tier cities within Southeast Asia? Any of you can answer that. Is that developing more from within the region, but also sort of the larger region to Middle East, if you will, airlift inbound into Southeast Asia into second tier cities?
Yeah, so I would say for Middle East at the moment, it's mostly the metro cities, but it's starting to develop a little bit. Here you have, obviously, Malaysia and Singapore, you have that Indian cultural overlay. So, Air Asia, for example, is really going strong into second and third tier cities. Singapore's outreach into third tier cities has been quite strong, and it was before the pandemic. They were miles ahead of anybody else. Malaysia's sort of catching up on that. Thailand and Bali, you are seeing more lift coming in from perhaps not maybe third tier cities yet, but sort of the upper second tier cities. But a lot of it, honestly, is being driven by the metro cities into Bali and into Bangkok at the moment.
Yeah. So I guess they consider Bali still as like a second tier city because the airport, compared to the rest of, there's not much besides tourism inflows into Bali.
Yeah. Yeah.
We haven't talked about Singapore. Thank you for bringing it up. Singapore, the state of Singapore tourism. Hannah, I don't know if you can just elaborate at the current state. Where is Singapore?
Yeah, I mean, Singapore, I think it finished last year in terms of arrivals. I think it was about 85% of 2019 levels. They just had their big tourism conference last week, so they've announced that they had a record number of tourism revenue that they generated there. I mean, of course, I don't know, once you factor in inflation, how much that has to do with the fact that it was a record year. I don't know. But I mean, they're certainly really trying to position themselves, I think, as a premium destination, as this hub, which they always have been. For music tourism, they had Taylor Swift last year, and that was the big thing that the rest of the region was very jealous of. So they're always the outliers. They're always thinking a little bit further ahead than some of the rest of the region.
Right.
So
they have the luxury too, just because that's not the only industry they have, and they're rich as a country. There seems to be some sort of nationalistic fervor further in Singapore, Gary, right? That has been the case in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, Singapore is very, very differentiated to the rest of the region. It has the highest GDP per capita, but by a country mile. I mean, the GDP per capita there is almost $100. If you compare that to Indonesia, it's about 5,000. In Vietnam, Indonesia is the largest economy in the region. In Vietnam, the GDP per capita is about 5,000. So it's a very special case, and because it has that extra money, that extra capital flow, it is much more forward thinking in terms of its investment in tourism. So it currently has a plan to 2040, which, given the current state of things in the world, is probably a little bit ambitious. But they actually set this in motion last year, so they obviously didn't quite know what was going to happen. But they are also the first country in the region that's actually revised down their GDP forecast for this year. They've revised down their GDP forecast to a range of 0 to 2%. So it's not going to grow very fast this year. And the issue for them is that if their currency doesn't grow, if tourism slows down, it's a very expensive destination. And you potentially could see a regression there into recession. It technically probably is in recession anyway, but it could get worse in Singapore.
Two countries that I'm fascinated by sitting from here in the US that I wish there were direct flights to. It's Malaysia and in Indonesia, two countries that they don't have direct flights to. Philippines has, because of a lot of Philippine expats and immigrants living here. Singapore has. Bangkok, is there a direct flight to Bangkok? I don't think there's a direct flight to Bangkok, but it's just Bangkok is more, Thailand is definitely more firm in people's heads in terms of what it offers. Cliches, yes, but at least there's more cliches than not. If you ask Malaysia, Indonesia, and if you tell people in Indonesia, the only thing they would know, if they know in US, would be Bali, because they would know Bali. They just don't know if it's part of Indonesia or not part of Indonesia. And so, in terms of long haul markets, particular like this is, I guess, ultra long haul, which would be US, Canada. What's the state of ultra long haul into the region? And I know that's a broad question, but if you want to take in terms of the different countries, some of them, obviously Singapore a lot better than others, but as you said, that's an outlier.
Okay, I think they're two very differentiated markets. Some of that is down to geography. Literally where they are placed in the world makes it quite difficult to have direct flights to the US. And in terms of the flight routes as well, I mean, if you're Philippines, you're much closer to the East Coast, to the West Coast. But
you're saying geographically the planes aren't even, is technically feasible to fly direct?
Well, it is technically feasible, but you basically for Thailand, if you're going to go to one route, you'll go via the Middle East, most likely. The other way, you'll go via Japan or you go via South Korea. The necessity to have direct flights hasn't been there because the market inbound particularly has been very, very seasonal. The outbound market just isn't strong enough. It's very much a leisure-focused market. But I would say in terms of Malaysia and Indonesia, they're just very, very diversified simply because of the size of them. And you're right about Indonesia when you say Bali. But even when you look at intra-regional travel, or you look at travel from the Middle East, or you look at travel from Australia into Indonesia, there are very few gateways. And the major gateway is Jakarta for business, Surabaya, Medan for business, Bali for leisure travel. I mean, there are the islands down in the far south of it, but there's not that many direct flights beyond Asia, beyond ASEAN into those routes. Malaysia is different. I mean, Malaysia actually, coming into KL, it makes sense that there should be more international direct flights to longer haul routes. Maybe we should get onto the tourism ministry to work on that, because it's a much smaller country and you have the options. It's a beautiful country. There's so much to visit in a short space of time. The infrastructure is much better. The infrastructure in Indonesia is very variable because it's just such a huge country. So they're just very, very different. But, Malaysia does have an opportunity. But Malaysia Airlines did used to fly to more international European and longer haul routes. And it basically pulled those back because it just wasn't getting any yield on them. It's now starting to expand. It's going to fly again to Paris, I think, and a couple of European destinations to test the waters to see if it's there. But the problem for Malaysia Airlines is it's surrounded by airlines that are simply better. So Singapore Airlines, Thailand has very, very good tie-up with Turkish Airlines. So the competition on those longer haul routes isn't just about when you launch and it's going to work. There are some good airlines in the region. Malaysia Airlines traditionally hasn't been one of those.
Yeah, AirAsia, obviously. I mean, you could say that AirAsia is probably the pioneer in unlocking travel into intra-travel within the region. Certainly, Tony would agree with that statement. But also happens to be true as well. It's like they were the pioneers that unlocked travel for a huge part of that world. In terms of business travel and MICE, what in this part of the world is just called meetings and events. I think in your part of the world it's called MICE travel, or maybe at least in parts of Asia it's called MICE travel. Is there a difference between leisure and business that you're seeing, Hannah, today as we are into April 2025?
In terms of inbound or outbound, or
both? I mean, business travel typically would be two-way travel. You would imagine in the best cases, but as I said, particularly as, for instance, U.S. is trying to diversify away from China. So Vietnam, as you know, is in the headlines for a lot of reasons right now. A lot of it is business travel. So I don't know if there's less effect on business travel than there is on leisure travel, or there's potentially less effect on business travel than there is on leisure travel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still all to play out. I mean, one interesting country where this kind of business travel is playing out is Indonesia. I mean, so Indonesia is going through a kind of austerity budget with the new president at the moment. And in fact, they have told the government they have to cut 50% of their travel budget, which doesn't sound like a big deal. I mean, you think, okay, how much is this going to impact the industry? It's impacting it massively, because it turns out that pretty much government travel has been subsidizing all of these very small hotels in these second-tier cities, these third-tier cities. And so right now, there's a lot of surveys out that there may well be redundancies. Hotels are going to have to close because they've been so reliant on that MICE travel, on the meetings and on those government travel that they've been doing into Indonesia, that they can't sustain it. They've got no other source of income. They haven't diversified. They're not really leisure. So they're kind of looking and saying, well, if nothing changes, we might have to fold. So it's kind of interesting that we're going through, they probably feel like they're going through a whole other, crisis. We've just had the pandemic and now they're going through this.
I think Hannah makes a really interesting point there, Rafa, because I think when you slice and dice what happened during COVID, obviously leisure travel was closed down in much of the region for 2-3 years if you were in China. Business travel, mostly the same as well. But what became very apparent was just how much government travel really drives travel industry in Asia Pacific. We are very policy driven region, and policy driven in terms of travel as well. And government travel is a very, very strong part of that. Now, at the moment, one thing that Donald Trump has done this year, and certainly this month, is he's reactivated government travel. You look around the region and there's a lot of trade negotiators going on. There's people on flights all the time. Xi Jinping is coming into Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia this week. He won't be the only one. The leaders from South Korea, Japan will be coming. The leaders of Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, they'll all be meeting each other. There's going to be a lot of government-derived travel. And, off the back of that, you have sub-meetings and sub-officials and all that kind of thing. It's a powerful part, and it's often overlooked just how important government travel is in the region.
And also, I happen to know this firsthand, in the larger region, many of these government departments happen to be glorified employment schemes as well for a lot of people. So, there are many agencies that hire a lot of people who you don't know what they're doing, but they're working and they're getting a pay, and it's a employment scheme. I won't name names, but I think all of you know many of these countries in the region as well. So there's just a lot of government employees because it's just what it is. This is the way to give jobs to people.
And extrapolating on to your first question about where this goes from here, I think honestly at the moment, Rafa, it's just too soon to say how much this global economic crisis, because it is a global economic crisis. There's no way around it. Even if Donald Trump completely backtracks and takes them off of takes the tariffs off the table, which he won't do, but if he did, the damage has been done, and there's going to be so much trade negotiation going on over the next few years. The whole global economy really is in turmoil, is in flux, and that is going to have some degree of impact on travel and tourism, particularly in a region like Southeast Asia, which is so reliant on trade, on exports, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and the problem there is that even if, let's say, everything goes back to what it was, whatever, 3 months ago, we don't know how his mind will change in like a week after that.
No, we don't, but we do know that relationships have changed. I think that there is, I wrote in my newsletter at the weekend, there is a diplomatically disguised fury in this region. Every country in the region is absolutely furious with the way that they've been treated, and that's not going to go away. Now, it's up to China what it does next. Obviously Xi Jinping is in the region. That's what he can do. He can come, geography helps him. He can come and he can start nurturing and negotiating very, very one-to-one straight away. Where that actually goes in future, I don't think anybody knows. I'm not sure that that's actually going to have a direct short-term impact. But it does mean that, Asia Pacific is much more tighter and is coordinating responses in a way that it wouldn't have done 6 months ago.
Speaking of tighter coordination between the countries in Southeast Asia, what's the state of sort of visa in across the region and within like travel, like equivalent of the Shenzhen in ASEAN or the larger Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I'll
Hannah,
take that one.
You tackle that?
Yeah, I will. So, I mean, this has been a bit of a pet project for the Thai Prime Minister, the former Thai Prime Minister, who was like, yes, we're going to have a 6-country visa for ASEAN and it's free access everywhere. I mean, it's not taken off. And even during the COVID, they talked about, let's have an intra-ASEAN travel corridor, and that didn't take off either. I think the fact is that nobody has enough motivation to make this kind of thing work. It just doesn't. ASEAN does not have the same setup as the EU like that. It doesn't have the same border controls. It doesn't have the same kind of central legislation to make this kind of thing work. And every country has different motivations for these visas. So the smaller ones like Laos or Cambodia say, oh, we need the visa fee. Still, it's still like this valuable source of revenue. Countries like Malaysia are already visa free for the majority of people. So for them, they'd be like, well, what difference does it make? We join this or not? They can already come to our country visa free. And I think there's just this intense competition for tourists right now that it doesn't lend itself very well to that spirit of cooperation. I mean, look, if you can't even cooperate during COVID to make tourism work, right? Like when it's cutthroat like now, you are not going to collaborate with your neighbors, are you? You're going to want to keep that spend, those tourists coming in.
Yeah, and also it's a giant geographical region, and so hopping from one and with connectivity not there. I mean, just in Indonesia, just in a single country, is such probably spread over the widest geographical area I think humanly possible in the planet, maybe in terms of how tens of thousands of islands. I forget what the number is, but it's a vast number of islands with hard to get to, many of them hard to get to. So it's quite hard in terms of the geographical breadth. And
I think also, Rafa, overlaying that as well is you look at the travel culture in Asia. So if you look at Thailand, for example, over 70% of its visitors are from Asia Pacific. And it's a short stay culture. People don't stay very long. They don't travel for long periods of time. It's very periodical and it's very much based around public holidays and festivals, that kind of thing. So yes, there's some longer haul, of course, and people stay a little bit longer. But 70% of the travel is short stay culture travel. And so why would you need, these expansive visas? They don't really make much sense.
What's the state of seasonality right now in Southeast Asia? I mean, technically you would assume it's equatorial climate, whatever the phrase is. And so, but I'm sure it's hellishly hot. I mean, we're going to be there in a month in Bangkok. It's going to be really, really hot in Bangkok in May and June and July and August, I guess. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it is very, I would say, and we always say this on the podcast as well, I think we're still trying to find back what this new pattern of seasonality is, like post-COVID, but a lot of it is driven around festivals. So right now, this week, we have Holy Week in the Philippines, so it's Easter. You've got Songkran in Thailand, Pimai in Laos, Tinghain in Myanmar. So you've got this peak travel period. Of course, you've got Lunar New Year, which is the other big driver. And then you have, I'd say, the peak of Europeans coming in at the end of the year. So they're coming for, they've got the colder climes, they call them the snowbirds, and then they're coming over for that bit of winter sun. So every country is kind of different, and it's just, I think, very driven around these big festivals that they have where you see these peaks, because a lot of it is short haul, medium haul travel, and then falls back down again.
Yeah, we generally say on the podcast, Rafa, that Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, because it's a regional holiday. If you get off to a good start in terms of your visitation during Chinese New Year, that's kind of a barometer for the rest of the year. And then you'll pick that up during the festivals and through the rest of the year. But this year was a bit of an exception because Eid and Chinese New Year were pretty close together, almost both in the first quarter, which is really unusual. You'd be expecting a good Eid maybe in July or June or July. There's a bit of period between, but this year they came very, very close together. And I think that's having some impact on travel volumes in the region because they were just too close together as major travel periods.
I mean, I guess, well, the Eid will continue to be earlier into the year over the next few years. So it will at some point cross over into December, but I'm going to say for the next 10 years, it's going to be coming 10 days earlier every year. So
it's something the region has to get used to.
Yeah. A lot of our focus on Skift, we've been talking a lot about a term we call life tourism. So it's essentially an umbrella term for sports and entertainment tourism. So group entertainment, leisure travel, group leisure travel. And there's a lot of movement around the world and around sports, music. Hannah, you just talked about Taylor Swift in Singapore. Is there, there's going to be, or at least we're going to try to do a bunch of discussion at our Skift Asia Forum next month in Bangkok around particularly sports tourism or live tourism in general. It seems that I'm just from the outside, is there less awareness of sports as a driver of tourism? It seems like a lot of the action is in Middle East and US. There's tons of action because of Olympics and World Cup and Olympics coming. How developed is the sports tourism market, and what do you think it will take to charge it?
I think for outbound is very strong. So, I've got friends in Malaysia that are going to watch Premier League matches every week. They go to the Olympics, they go to the Australian Open is very, very strong from China, for example. But in Southeast Asia, there's just not enough A-level events, A-grade events. They don't have enough of these major events that really drag people to you have to go to. What we tend to get is we tend to get end of season Premier League teams playing friendlies or European teams playing friendlies. We get ASEAN tournaments, that kind of thing. But there's just not enough. And I mean, you're pointing to the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is just cleaning up on this at the moment. It's got everything. It's got Formula One. It's got boxing. It's got athletics. It's got tennis. Really, really A-list events. And we don't have any in Southeast Asia. China has tried to get some, and I think China will be a really strong market for this going forward. India probably too. But it's attracting those events. And for Southeast Asia, honestly, it's easier to attract Taylor Swift or Bruno Mars or Lady Gaga than it is to get a major tourism, a sporting event over a period of time. It just hasn't happened yet.
So I want to move to a topic related to sports tourism, since we're talking about sports. White Lotus has created this wave of attention to Thailand. I guess Bali came into people's consciousness in the West very much on the backs of, or at least for a certain subset of people, on Eat, Pray, Love, the book, and then the movie that came after, total dud. The movie, I hated the book, but I went through my own Eat, Pray, Love journey. That's a whole different podcast. But in terms of one, let's talk about the White Lotus effect, and then two, from a larger perspective, perceptions of Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia's effort to get these types of shows and movies, etc., into the region. So, Hannah, you want to start with the White Lotus effect so far?
Sure. I mean, I think as we read in the media, there does seem to be this huge upswing. I mean, if you look on Google Destination Insights, you can see this big spike, right? As soon as White Lotus came out, all of these states were looking at the TV going, ooh, Thailand, okay, let's book. Ooh, Koh Samui, okay, where's that? All right, yeah, let's book. I mean, And I guess that's what Thailand was banking on. Of course, they've had loads of publicity about this out for ages, and TAT have really been, the Tourism Authority of Thailand have really been maximizing that. So that's not a surprise. And, you know, in the region, I think we're very used to film tourism driving things. I mean, a lot of the region follow K-drama very closely, all of these Korean dramas, and where they go, they want to go. So the classic example is this K-drama Crash Landing on You is filmed in Switzerland. There's this scene in this Lake Brienz, and all the Filipino travelers, when they go to Switzerland, they want to go to that lake. You know, I've spoken to someone at Switzerland Tourism. He says that lake isn't even anything special. It's nothing different to other lakes you could go to, but it's because it was filmed there. That's why everybody wants to go there. So I think it's very influenced by that. Yeah, it's having the effect, but whether it's a good effect, whether that's the right thing to do.
And is it a long-lasting effect?
Yeah, is it a long-lasting effect? And, you know, everything on this island, Koh Samui, is already struggling with water management, waste management, all of these kind of issues as a typical island is facing. So, you know, it's that long-term effect and whether it's quite the right choice to do it there or not.
And obviously the question is repeat visitation after. Like, do these types of sort of, for lack of a better word, gimmicks, these are not gimmicks, but just let's run with it, bring long-term repeat visitation? If you're coming for, I mean, in theory, if you're coming for a sports game, for instance, and you're able to come to Bangkok and visit this game, and you'll say, okay, next time I'm going to come with my family, and I'll spend more time in not just Bangkok but other parts of the country. That's, I think, Saudi. That's what they're one of their strategies is that this is the sampler for first timers coming into Saudi. They will say, oh wow, this is much different than what my perception was, and then that will lead to repeat visitation after. So I think that's the best case scenario if it happens. So I guess in movies, I don't know if that has been proven beyond a doubt that that's what it leads to. Is there a concerted effort, Gary, from the region in terms of developing relations with Hollywood and TV studios, and not just in Hollywood, but also India, for instance, etc., which has a giant, as you know, movie industry bigger than Hollywood even?
Absolutely. And you know, I mean, movie tourism from India is nothing new. I mean, Hollywood movies have been filming in Switzerland or in Malaysia or Japan for many years. It's not essentially new. I think you raise a good point about how it's used tactically in terms of repeat visitation, and it hasn't really been used that way yet in Southeast Asia. It's been used to draw flash events, to push up hotel rooms at particular times, particularly concerts, and also with White Lotus. I think Japan and South Korea probably lead the way in terms of trail tourism. Japan, Hannah mentioned the K movies, the K-pop stars. You know, they have a lot of trail tours around the country where you can go to different locations related to a band, to a film, to the stars. And that actually encourages people to get off track, to hire a car and to go around the country. We haven't really seen that yet in Southeast Asia, but I guess that's coming in future. But I would say the leaders in terms of soft power, but also using it to drive tourism into, you know, decentralized areas, tertiary areas, coastal areas. South Korea is very good at that.
Let's talk about South Korea and Japan because we haven't really talked about it. Demographically, both the countries are not doing well in terms of population, aging population. So long-term decline already happening. The future, if you want to see the future of the world in terms of falling birth rates, you should look at Japan as well as Korea. This is examples that everybody has looked at. South Korea now has the lowest birth rate in the whole world. It's last year, or I think read something that the government estimated that there would be, so replacement rate is 2.1 births per couple for the population to remain steady. Last year, the government estimated it was going to be 0.7. The actual was 0.6. So it's really in a very critical state in South Korea. Japan, many stories about how the birth rate, obviously, and the marriage, etc. rate has fallen dramatically as well. what that has resulted in is outbound obviously is smaller and smaller, and long term will continue to be smaller and smaller. Japanese tourists, if any of you remember who are listening to, and you both of you may remember, Japanese tourists with their cameras came out in the droves in the 80s and 90s. Times Square was overrun by them, but that's a very that's way in the past. Inbound, they've become museums in good and bad ways that the world is visiting. Is there, and Japan has been like every second person over the last year, 2 years in my circle is either going to Japan, in Japan, or came back from Japan. And so it's an ultra long haul market, and not a cheap one as well. Well, not cheap to fly to, but I think Japan is cheap when you get there compared to US. So what's the upper limit on Japanese tourism? And then contrast Japan to South Korea.
Wow, that's a really good question. Okay, in terms of Japan and South Korea, you're absolutely right in terms of the demographic issues. And both countries are actually a pretty interesting social experiments, because the governments have tried absolutely everything, every type of incentivization, tax breaks to move to different parts of the country to encourage people to have kids, and it just hasn't worked. And so it's pretty interesting as a sort of mid-20s social experiment. But when it comes to travel, you're right. The outbound market from Japan, just before COVID, but certainly since COVID, has just fallen flat. It's been just remarkable how slow it's been to recover, and that obviously has impacts on the airlines and where they're going to route a lot of their services. Inbound to Japan, as you say, completely strong at the moment. There's possibly a sense that it had its post-COVID moment, that it was one of those desirable destinations that everybody during COVID decided we've got to go. Like our travel has been so restricted. We haven't had our freedoms for 2 years. If we're going to go anywhere, let's go to Japan. And I think there was a degree of that. And obviously Japan had the falling yen, which kind of incentivized a little bit people, particularly in the region, to go to Japan, because it is generally quite expensive. But has that sort of massive growth, is that going to taper? Is that going to slow? Well, in the first quarter of this year, it hasn't actually. There's still a lot of people going. One of the things from this region that you have, particularly from China, definitely, is you have access to a lot of different cities. So flights go into not just Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, they go to a lot of different cities. So that is, and Hokkaido is very, very popular for skiing. They had a really, really strong skiing season this year. But where does it go from here? It's tricky. There's a lot of interesting tour operators in Japan that are really looking at nature tourism and the future of regenerative tourism. They're quite forward thinking on that. But will they have the volumes going forward? Difficult to say. Korea is a slightly different case, because it really has traded on, as Hannah said, its soft power of the Korean music, films, culture, wellness, aesthetics, all of those things. And they're still very popular, particularly with the younger audience in Asia Pacific. It's a very, very strong young person traveler.
And even in the US, a lot of US particularly as well. I mean, the BTS and Middle East, BTS is huge in Middle East.
Right. And Blackpink, two of Blackpink played it at Coachella this week, but they played on separate stages. But, they're very, very popular, and there's loads of other bands that are following in their footsteps. The outbound market from Korea is much more interesting, and it's quite concentrated, particularly in our parts of the region, Vietnam, Philippines, very, very strong. Koreans are traveling a little bit more in a more diversified way than the Japanese at the moment. But they're in many ways, geographically, they're very similar. The nature of both destinations relatively similar, but they are very, very diversified countries, inbound, outbound, and domestic.
Let's start closing. We're doing this podcast a year from now. The three of us are talking, and you said the best case scenario has played out. What will be the best case scenario for the region? Of course, there's no one answer, because there's different countries with different types of things, but Thailand being the most visited, so maybe we can start with that.
Well, I guess one of the it's a difficult question, right? Because so many things could happen in 1 year, and what's best. Yeah. But do you know what? If the region are deciding not to travel out to countries like the US, maybe one of the best is that they decide to travel more intra-Asian, right, and stay here. and kind of soften that blow, and maybe that boosts it, and they kind of can, somehow muddle through, I think.
I would concur with that. I think the best case scenario for the region definitely is that China doesn't get hit too hard economically, and that Chinese are traveling around the region once again. I think more eyes will come onto India. Honestly, I think they will, Rafat. The Indian economy has a lot of potential, a lot of opportunities here, and that could encourage more travel from the region. And we would hope that happens. You really want to see a strong China and a strong India in the region, because that will just boost the whole of the travel ecosystem, not just in terms of the number of travelers, but the investment that comes into the region as well, which is a very, very important part of the future plans of governments here, is investment driven, particularly in terms of infrastructure, airports, railways, roads, that kind of thing. We're going to need investment from India and from China and from Japan and South Korea and the Middle East as well. So the best case scenario, Rafa, is that the tariffs fall off a cliff and everything goes back to normal. That's not going to happen, I know, but I think that the pillar economies are just so important to this region.
In terms of affordability, generally the perception here in the West is that obviously it's very affordable to travel to Southeast Asia. Singapore is a little bit different, but other than Singapore, it's very affordable to travel. In the intra-regional context, is it affordable enough for the people who do travel intra-regionally, generally speaking?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the issues the region's been facing is more with domestic flights. So, say Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, the governments there have already been doing quite a bit of work to try and bring down the domestic airfares, because they feel that that's holding back domestic travel. And, even we had a guest on the podcast from Indonesia the other day who said actually it's cheaper to fly internationally to KL. So she made a point, if you wanted to fly from 2 points in Indonesia, it might actually be cheaper to fly to KL to get between these two destinations than even fly domestically within Indonesia.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's and then Australia, from what I understand, obviously is very high outbound, very expensive outbound. Am I correct? Because Qantas has, I guess, or at least that was the big thing against Qantas, is like they have a monopoly on the routes outside of Australia.
That's starting to change. They're actually deregulating quite a rate, actually. And from Southeast Asia, a lot of the low cost carriers now have got more and more routes. It took a while after COVID for them to get their routes back and for the prices to come down. The prices are still higher than they were pre-pandemic, but they're much more affordable. And what you do see from Southeast Asia, particularly from Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, is you see a lot of travel during the Australian winter, because it's a little bit cheaper. It's not as hot. And it's a different time to travel. People in this region aren't used to cooler temperatures, and that's a big appeal for Australia. And they market that quite well in the region.
Yeah. Actually, speaking of cooler temperatures, I got to end on this question. Otherwise, there's going to be some comment. Somebody's going to say, you didn't ask any question about climate change. So let's ask about climate change and end there. How does it, as you said, the temperature doesn't change that much, or it stays within a spectrum. Only the humidity changes, I guess. In much of the region, that's not true all across, as you know. But how does it manifest in Southeast Asia? Is it in terms of extreme weather, or is it just it becomes too hot to, obviously in summer it's too hot, etc.? How does climate change manifest inbound into Southeast Asia?
I mean, definitely in terms of extreme weather. So last year we had a lot of typhoons hit the region. You've got lots of flooding. All of these, you have haze, which is kind of what we call air pollution here. So it's this nice word, but essentially smog, right? That's from the burning.
Yeah, Delhi is the same thing, just because I happen to know India quite well. Yeah.
Exactly. So you've got all of this combination of some man-made, some natural, but it gets to the point where, if you were traveling to northern Thailand about this kind of time, March, April, you might think twice, because you might know that it's the smog season there because of the haze and the burning, and therefore you might reconsider. So I do see it's going to be the next big impact on travel patterns for people, probably more regionally to start off with, because, okay, we're in Malaysia, we know that about Thailand. Maybe if you're sat there in the US, you might not be so aware that that's the case and you'll just book anyway. But eventually it's going to, trickle through.
All right. Well, thank you, folks. This is very informative. We can go on for hours. There's tons of questions that we didn't even ask about wellness and luxury, and because that's generally, again, if you sitting here in the U.S., there's that yes, it's cheap, but also there's that you can get luxury at cheap is also the perception in this part of the world. But we didn't get to that. Let's hold that for a future podcast. And my team will kill me if I don't mention Skift Asia Forum is coming May 14th and 15th, and which both Gary and Hannah. Hannah, are you there? Because I know Gary's there, but I think you're there too. You are there. I'm saying you're there. You're going to be there.
Well, I am now, Rafat. There we go. Heard it here first.
So both of you are going to be there. This is our sort of first conference in the region. We did have in Singapore in 2019, but it's such a different world, as you know, as we just talked about pre-COVID. In Singapore, we had, which was a big hit, and hopefully this will be a big hit as well. There's some great speakers. If you go to live.skift.com, you will see, and you'll see both me, all three of us there in person. Maybe we'll do a live podcast there as a follow-up, or what's happening on stage, or right after. So Becca, let's plan for a follow-up if we can. Okay. All right. Thank you, folks. Thank you for that. And hope to see you in a month.
Thank you for listening to the Skift Travel Podcast. Wherever you're listening, please make sure to subscribe. If you like what you're hearing, rate us 5 stars or leave us a positive review. It really helps get the word out about us, our podcast, and make sure that we can still continue to bring it to you free of charge every week.
If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell as well. That way you'll know every time we have a new episode.